When I first heard about the Mad Gasser of Mattoon, I immediately conjured up this image in my head of some crazed lunatic in a gas mask pumping gas into the pipes of a home and running away cackling into a stormy night. The reality of this case is much more psychologically interesting than that. The story of the Mad Gasser begins on August 31st, 1944 in the town of Mattoon, Illinois, which is part of central Illinois. However, I think technically speaking it's still southern Illinois. It's closer to the center part of the state. On the night of August 31st, 1944, Mr. and Mrs. Urban Rafe were all settled in for a long winter's nap when suddenly Urban was awoken by a strange smell, and he nudged his wife and said, "Did you leave the stove on or something?" And she said, "No, I didn't leave the stove on, let me go check." And she goes to check and finds that she's paralyzed. The next morning their neighbor reported having similar symptoms in the middle of the night, and the story kind of spread around town in the local gossip. The very next night a similar event happened. Mrs. Bert Kearney was awoken and by a strange smell and was paralyzed. She couldn't move. She screamed for help and the neighbors ran to her. They could find no sign of some kind of attack or anything, or any smell of gas or anything like that. But nevertheless, Mrs. Kearney reported this, and that same night, without knowing what had just happened hours before, Bert, her husband, came in from work and spotted a prowler out by the house and by the window. He chased said prowler into the woods and lost him in the darkness and returned to his house. Bert reports that the assailant was dressed in all black, and this report made it to the newspapers the next day, and the news does what it does best and ran with it. The local press immediately jumped on the idea that the gas was spread by someone intentionally pumping it into homes, and this is where the name the Mad Gasser of Mattoon comes from. It was one of the headlines at the local newspaper. But the first headline on the morning of September 2nd, after the attacks had happened the previous 2 days, was "Anesthetic Prowler on the Loose." And now it begins. By September 5th, there were 4 more reports of gas attacks happening in the night. Each of them very similar, each of them reporting a very sweet smell, followed by nausea and paralysis. Later that same night, September 5th, Carl and Beulah Cordes returned home to find a white cloth on their doorstep. Beulah picked it up, noticed a funny smell coming from it, brought it to her nose to sniff it closer, and nearly fainted. She didn't faint, but she nearly fainted. She became nauseous and woozy and had to be helped inside by her husband Carl. Her condition only worsened as time went on, and she began to swell at the face and her mouth began to bleed. When police came to investigate, they found an empty tube of lipstick and a key also on the porch, along with the white cloth that Beulah had sniffed and had sent her into what she was dealing with currently. The hysteria in the town only grew from this, and the local police force was so baffled they even eventually called in 2 FBI agents from Springfield. Although the FBI agents did nothing to ease the hysteria of the town, probably only added to it, and does what the government does best, they did nothing. At this point, people took to the streets. There were vigilante groups along with groups of police officers, and probably Barney and Gomer from the FBI were along with them as well. The vigilante group actually arrested a suspect, but the suspect failed lie detector tests and was released. There were many reports of gassings. I believe there were up to 30, if not more, reports of gassings within the town of Mattoon, which at the time only sported a population of about 17,000. The next 2 incidents are rather interesting. I believe they occurred on the same night, however I could be wrong about that, so don't quote me. They both involved families. One was a mother and her son who reported hearing someone trying to break into the house, so they ran out thinking it was the gasser. They ran out, but the house filled with gas and they both collapsed and passed out. I believe they passed out, they may not have, but if they did, this is the first and I believe only occurrence of someone passing out from the gas attacks that happened in Mattoon. The next attack was several people in the same house, and they also reported the sounds of someone trying to break in before the house filled with gas. These people, however, reported hearing a buzzing sound which they attributed to the gasser's apparatus at work while he pumped gas into the house. The last gasser attack took place on September 13th at the home of Bertha Bench and her son Orville, who reported seeing the gasser through the window and describing the gasser as a woman dressed up like a man, and later on that night finding women's footprints, at least the footprints of someone in high heels, underneath the window. This would align with some of the evidence that was found at the home of Carl and Beulah Cordes. Remember, Beulah was the one who found the white cloth covered in some sort of fumes, noxious gas, something like that. The police also found an empty tube of lipstick at the scene. Keep in mind this was in the 1940s, so a woman wouldn't really have been suspected to do things like this. If you think that's sexist, then wait for what the police said and what most psychologists at the time chalked it up to. The Mattoon Police Department released an official statement about the gassings during the time period when it was happening. I don't believe this was after or before, but this was the statement that the police officers made to the public over the radio. The entire incident was likely the result of explainable occurrences exacerbated by public fears and a sign of the anxiety felt by women while men were at war. So essentially the police department said women. After this, the local police stopped giving the cases much credit and essentially just wrote it off as, women have feelings, so they could clearly have imagined the Mad Gasser. Anyway, it was the 40s, what are you going to do? But essentially now the case of the Mad Gasser of Mattoon is listed among cases of mass hysteria. The accepted belief is that nothing happened. It was just a case of mass hysteria brought on by wartime fears. Now, this isn't totally invalid. There were several cases that makes it entirely unlikely for one gasser to have gassed all these people in the short 2-week time period that it happened. There's also this thing we have to take into account that no one died. No one even really passed out. The most serious case came from Beulah Cordes, who experienced swelling of the face along with mouth bleeding, things like that. Everyone else pretty much just felt woozy, nauseous, and experienced paralysis. Now that's kind of serious, but really paralyzed for 30 minutes or, an entire town dead in a gas attack? I don't know. At the time, there was this kind of hysterical idea going around that there was a Nazi loose in town, a Nazi spy, and he was testing out some kind of new poison gas that the Germans would be using. This was reported in the news that there could be German gas tests happening or gas attacks happening in the States. So this is, wartime fears are a serious thing. Wartime paranoia, wartime hysteria. These are real things that happen to people. So I'm not claiming that the entire incident of the Mad Gasser is completely real, but also the public report of just like women is kind of a little ridiculous, I think. There is also the theory that wind blew gas over from a local chemical plant, and that is what caused the hysteria, the paralysis, the symptoms of gas attacks. And this sort of might explain why none of the attacks were all that severe. Some people will believe that it was just the gas being blown over from this chemical plant. The CEO of this plant said that the gases they claimed were blowing over are stuff they use in their fire extinguishers and not what they would use at the plant itself. For anything they would be doing. This has been kind of dispelled, and I also don't believe that this theory has all that merit to it, because wouldn't we see periods of this happening all the time when wind gusts were high or something like that? Well, one could say that maybe something leaked out of the plant, freak accident or something leaked at the plant, and then this happened in Mattoon. Possibly. I don't write that out, but I don't necessarily buy into that theory. The theory I buy into is that there was a gasser, and that the gasser probably sprayed gas into the homes of about 4 or 5 different families within Mattoon, possibly 6 or 7, not the 30-plus cases that were seen around Mattoon. This is a case of both a real-life crazed serial gasser and mass hysteria around that serial gasser. What this still doesn't explain is why none of the gas attacks were lethal. What was their end game? If this occurred for 2 weeks, wouldn't they improve their formula if they were going for death? What was the gasser's motive? What was their end game? I believe that the gasser was likely a woman in town. I don't necessarily have any kind of evidence for that, other than the idea that the last people who saw the gasser claimed that she was a woman, and there was the empty tube of lipstick found, things like that. Perhaps this was sort of a class thing, perhaps this was politically motivated. What certainly was politically motivated was the ending of the gas attacks, and by that I mean by the press. The press sort of completely switched their language around the attacks from overhyping it to making people feel silly for even wanting to report these attacks. More attacks could have happened that were real, but the press sort of shamed everyone out of it. This was brought on as a political move for the local police department because the citizens of Mattoon were getting mad, and they were about to hold a big protest towards the police department before they released their statement, and all of this happened. So essentially the police department sort of used the news to shut up the people of Mattoon, and they quit responding to calls about the gasser, they quit responding to reports of the gasser, and essentially swept the whole thing under the rug, and they all ended on September 13th. Was the last time a gasser attack was reported, and is simply kind of faded off into this weird little pocket of true crime history. So what do I think? I think the gasser was a real person, and I also think the town of Mattoon experienced severe mass hysteria. So some of the things that happened were probably real and probably did happen, and some of the things were probably results of the mass hysteria the town felt. Also, a lot of this was probably brought on by the news. We see this today. Anytime there's a serial killer, they get this super cool name. The Mad Gasser of Mattoon, how cool is that? Just all this stuff. And the gasser was probably a resident of the town, so they probably got the morning newspaper, and they probably read the Mad Gasser of Mattoon. Even Time magazine wrote about this. This made national news, by the way. This was a national headline. Gasser, who probably lives in Mattoon, is reading this, getting more hyped, and probably going out and just gassing as many people as he can just to get more exposure, get the more news coverage, more of that kind of a thing, more attention, so that he became more and more infamous. They became more and more infamous. I believe it's probably a she, but I'm just going to say they because no one really knows. Like I said, we see this thing today. We've got the Butcher of Plainfield, that's Ed Gein. We've got the Night Stalker. We've got the Zodiac Killer. All these super cool sounding names, and they get movies, and they get Netflix TV shows, and they get all this hype around what they did, even though their actions are abhorrent and evil. They get promoted in the media, and everyone just blows them up and thinks it's so cool. And this is how people like Jeffrey Dahmer get fan letters. It's so sick and gross, but it's the way the American news media works. The only piece of art I've seen that significantly criticizes this is the movie Nightcrawler. If you haven't seen it, it's starring Jake Gyllenhaal, and it's really good. I recommend it. I'm not going to spoil it or anything. This isn't a review of Nightcrawler. This whole thing wasn't to bring Nightcrawler into this. But it really explains how the news media pushes for the grotesque and gory, because that's what sells. That's what people watch. That's what people want to see, because people are sick. So there you have it. People are sick. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you on the next one. Bye. There is dog bark break.